I never planned to stop by the river that night, never planned to look over the rusted guardrail or hear a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the water. And yet if I hadn't, everything I thought I knew about fate, about courage, about the quiet price of doing the right thing, would be different now. Because the river doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither does whatever followed me out of it. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind that turns streets into mirrors and thoughts into regrets, and I was driving home after another empty shift, another day where nothing mattered enough to be remembered, when I saw her shoe first, small, white, spinning slowly in the current near the edge like it was waiting for someone to notice. And I should have kept driving, should have told myself it was none of my business. But something tightened in my chest, and my foot hit the brake before my mind caught up. And when I stepped out, the roar of the river swallowed every other sound until I heard it, faint but unmistakable, a voice breaking under the weight of the water, calling for help in a way that didn't sound human anymore but desperate, raw, stripped down to survival. I ran to the edge and saw her below, tangled in branches, half submerged, her dark hair plastered to her face, eyes wide with terror as the river dragged at her body like it wanted to pull her apart, piece by piece. And in that moment there was no heroism, no bravery, only fear and a choice that felt irreversible. Because once you step into a river like that, you don't get to decide how it ends. I didn't think about the current or the cold or the fact that I couldn't swim well enough to fight it. I just climbed over and jumped, and the shock of the water stole the air from my lungs, crushed my chest, burned my skin as if the river was alive and angry that I dared challenge it. And I remember thinking, this is how it ends. Not in some meaningful way, just another body carried downstream, another warning sign ignored. But then my hand found fabric, my fingers locked around her arm, and she screamed when I pulled her free from the branches, screamed like she'd been holding it in since the moment she fell. And the river fought us both, slamming us into rocks, twisting us under, filling my mouth with mud and blood and panic until I lost all sense of direction. And if you've never been that close to drowning, you don't understand how quiet it becomes inside your head, how the world narrows to the need for air and nothing else. But somehow we reached the bank, somehow my knees hit solid ground and my hands dug into wet soil, and I dragged her out, inch by inch, until the river had no more of her to claim. And when it was over, when the noise faded and the rain softened and I realized I was still breathing, she collapsed against me, shaking so violently I thought she might break apart, and she kept whispering thank you over and over like she was afraid the words would disappear if she stopped saying them. The police came, the ambulance lights painted the trees red and blue, and they wrapped her in a blanket and asked me questions. I barely heard because all I could see were her eyes, locked on mine, unblinking, as if letting go meant falling back into the water. And before they took her away, she grabbed my wrist with a strength that didn't match her size and said my name even though I hadn't told her, said it like she'd always known it. And that should have been my first warning. But I was too busy telling myself it was just shock, just trauma, just coincidence. The next morning my body ached like I'd been beaten, bruises blooming across my ribs and arms, and I almost convinced myself the whole thing had been a dream until I found the dried river mud still caked into my shoes, until I turned on my phone and saw messages from friends who'd seen the local news clip calling me a hero, a word that felt wrong, heavy, undeserved. And if you're watching this story right now, if you're listening and thinking you know where it's going, understand this. I thought it was over too. I thought saving her was the end of it, the moment where the story fades out and life goes back to normal. And that's why stories like this matter, why channels that tell them matter, because some endings are just beginnings wearing a disguise. I noticed her again 3 days later, standing across the street from my apartment building, no umbrella despite the drizzle, just watching the entrance like she was waiting for something to happen. And when our eyes met, she smiled, slow and relieved, like she'd finally found something she'd lost. And my stomach dropped because that smile didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to someone who felt certain, and certainty can be far more frightening than fear. She didn't approach, didn't wave, just turned and walked away once she knew I'd seen her. And I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining patterns where none existed. But then she was there again the next day, and the next, sometimes closer. sometimes farther, always watching, and never speaking, until one evening when I left work late and found her sitting on the steps of my building like she lived there, her hair dry now, her clothes clean, her face calm in a way that made my skin crawl, and she looked up at me and said, "You took me out of the river. I didn't have anywhere else to go." And there it was, the weight of a decision I didn't remember making, the invisible thread tying my life to hers. And as I let her inside, as I told myself I was just being kind, just doing what anyone would do, I couldn't shake the feeling that the river hadn't finished with either of us yet, and that whatever I'd pulled from the water that night had followed me home. Because sometimes when you save someone's life, you don't just give them a future, you become it. And if you want to hear what happened next, if you want to understand how one act of courage can spiral into something you can't escape, make sure you stay with this story, because what followed changed everything. And stories like this only reach the people who need them. When you support the channel, subscribe, and become part of the journey, because once you hear the rest, you'll understand why some rescues never truly end. I told myself letting her stay was temporary, just until she found her footing again, just until the shock faded and the memory of the river loosened its grip on her mind, because that's what rational people tell themselves when they don't want to examine the fear crawling up their spine. And for the first few days, everything seemed almost normal in a fragile, carefully balanced way. She spoke softly, moved quietly through my apartment, like she was afraid of leaving fingerprints on my life, and thanked me constantly in ways that felt too deep, too personal, as if gratitude had fused itself to her identity. But there were little things that didn't sit right, like how she never asked where anything was yet always knew, how she'd set my coffee exactly the way I liked it without seeing me make it before, how she'd sometimes stare out the window at night, toward the distant glow of the river, and smile faintly, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. I tried to talk to her about what happened, about why she'd been in the water that night, but her answers slid around the truth, vague and slippery, stories that started strong and dissolved into silence. And when I pressed too hard, she'd flinch, her fingers tightening around her sleeves, and say the river had taken everything from her except me. And that should have made me feel honored, but instead it felt like a weight settling on my chest, because nobody should ever make you the only thing they have left. People at work treated me differently now, whispers of heroism following me down hallways, and I smiled and nodded and played the role. But every night when I came home and found her waiting, watching, listening, it felt like the river had followed me indoors, like its current was still moving beneath the floorboards, patient and unstoppable. She began walking me to work, always a step behind, always quiet. And when I told her she didn't have to, she said she knew. She just wanted to make sure I was safe. And the irony of that almost made me laugh, because safety was the one thing I no longer felt. The first time I realized how far this had gone was when I mentioned a co-worker in passing, a harmless comment, and watched something dark flicker behind her eyes, gone in an instant, but sharp enough to cut. And later that night she asked questions about her, about where she lived, about whether she mattered to me. Her voice calm but stretched tight like a wire about to snap. And I told myself it was trauma, that people cling when they're pulled back from death, that I was imagining danger because stories train us to expect it. But real life doesn't announce itself with warning. Music, it creeps in slowly, wearing familiarity like a disguise. Things started going missing then, small things at first. My phone moved from where I'd left it. A notebook opened to pages I didn't remember writing in. And once I woke in the middle of the night to find her sitting at the edge of my bed, watching me breathe, her face peaceful, almost grateful. And when I asked what she was doing, she said she was making sure I was still here, because sometimes people disappear when you're not looking, and she couldn't bear to lose me the way she'd lost the rest of her world. I told her she needed help, real help, and she smiled sadly and said she already had it, that the river had given her clarity, that when you're about to die you see the truth. And the truth was that some people are meant to save others, and some are meant to be saved. And once those paths cross, they're never supposed to separate again. The breaking point came when I came home early one afternoon and found my apartment rearranged, my photos taken down, replaced with new ones printed and framed. Photos of us together that I didn't remember taking. Moments from walks, from meals, from ordinary days stitched into a narrative I hadn't agreed to. And she stood there proudly, eyes shining, and said she wanted our home to reflect what we were becoming. And in that moment the fear crystallized into something undeniable. Because this wasn't gratitude anymore, this was possession. And the river doesn't give back what it claims without taking something in return. I told her she had to leave, that I'd help her find somewhere else, that this wasn't healthy. And for the first time since I'd known her, she cried, not loud or dramatic, just silent tears tracing the same path down her cheeks again and again, like they'd learned the way. And she asked if I knew what it felt like to be dragged under, to know you're about to vanish, and then feel hands pulling you back into the light. And how could I expect her to walk away from the only anchor she'd ever known? And the guilt hit harder than fear, because saving someone doesn't end when they're breathing again. It lingers, it asks for more than you thought you had to give. That night I dreamed of the river, of standing on the bank watching her struggle while my feet stayed rooted to the ground. And when I woke she was gone, her things vanished, the apartment silent in a way that felt final. And for a brief, shameful moment I felt relief, until I found the note on the table, written in careful, deliberate handwriting, thanking me for everything, telling me she understood now, that love means letting go, that she'd return to the river to finish what it started. And panic erased every other thought as I ran, because some promises can't be undone, and some stories refuse to end quietly. I found her at the same spot where it all began, the river swollen and dark beneath the moon, and she stood at the edge, calm and resolute, saying she needed to know whether I'd save her again, whether what we had was real or just a moment of weakness. And in that terrible, frozen second I understood the truth, that she wasn't asking to be saved from the water. She was asking to be saved from herself, and maybe from me too. And I stepped forward, not to pull her back, but to tell her that life isn't a debt you can repay by chaining yourself to someone else, that survival doesn't mean surrendering your future. And for a long time she just stared at me, the river roaring between us like a living thing, until finally she stepped away from the edge, collapsing into sobs that sounded like the river breaking apart inside her. I stayed until help came, until professionals took over, until she was no longer my responsibility to carry alone. And months passed after that, months of quiet, of rebuilding, of learning that doing the right thing once doesn't obligate you to sacrifice your entire life. And sometimes I still see the river in my dreams, still wonder what part of her stayed behind in its depths and what part moved on. But she doesn't follow me anymore, not in the streets, not in the shadows, only in memory. A reminder that courage has consequences and kindness has weight. And if you've stayed with this story until now, if you've felt the pull of the river and the tension of that choice, then you already understand why stories like this matter, why they deserve to be told and heard. Because somewhere someone is standing at the edge of their own decision right now. And maybe this story reaches them in time. But that only happens when you support the channel, when you subscribe, when you help these voices travel farther than they could alone. Because sometimes a story isn't just entertainment, it's a lifeline, and you never know who might be listening.
Subscribe to my channel.